Okay, so today's workshop is a part of a professional development series on anti-racism for the newcomer-serving sector. So we hope that with this knowledge that's shared today, that we can strengthen relationships and build capacity to tackle issues around racism that impact folks in all levels of the sector, from frontline staff to management to EDs. The workshop will encourage us to expand our understanding of white supremacy and how it shows up in the work that we do. Today's speaker, her name is Rana Nazzal Hamadeh. She is an artist, a filmmaker, a writer, and a facilitator, and she brings a wonderful interdisciplinary approach to systemic issues. I will pass it on to Rana, and please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone who's joined us already, and to the folks streaming in. I'm joining you today from unceded Anishinaabe territory in what's known as Ottawa. Like big parts of the country, Ottawa is unceded, which means that the Anishinaabe people never signed away the land. So put bluntly, it means that the land is stolen, which isn't to say that treaty land was not also coerced, but that by Canada's own colonial laws, the land was never legally handed over. I know that most of you are joining from Toronto, which is the traditional Mohawk name for the region called Toronto. And that Toronto is the territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people who have resisted settler colonialism in multifold ways for hundreds of years and whose struggles demand our active solidarity. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Rana Nazzal. I am a Palestinian artist and organizer, and I've lived between Palestine and Toronto or Ottawa for the past decade. I just returned from about 2 years in the West Bank, where I was working with a political prisoners organization. And I worked in the newcomer sector in Ottawa before that, out of the counseling department in the Ottawa Community Immigrant Services Organization, where I developed pilot programs for refugee and immigrant youth primarily. Before that, I was running workshops like this one for several years with young people. My family came to Turtle Island as a result of exile from Palestine. And, despite our struggles in their own right, since arriving, we've benefited immensely from institutions and systems that have been designed to advantage settlers and to disadvantage Indigenous peoples. So we'll be talking about white supremacy culture and anti-racism today. And it's just important that we recognize that this culture became dominant because it spread with capitalism and with colonialism. And as we challenge racism in our organizations, we also have to be ready to work towards the decolonization of these lands, which means fighting for the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. And I will include some resources at the end. Let's jump in. So we have a big agenda today, but before we start, I'm just going to go over a couple notes. You are muted for now, but please use the chat to comment as we're going or to add to the discussion. I know that's how a lot of folks learn, is by engaging as we go, so please don't hesitate to write in the chat. You've already mentioned that this session is recorded. The breakout rooms shouldn't be. Since we're talking about racism and oppression in the spaces that we work, what we talk about could trigger past experiences that can initiate panic or shutdown or anger. If you need to, please step away from the screen, get in touch with someone from your support network, and do whatever you need to do for yourself. This is especially true when we're on Zoom and we're not actually together. We will go over the agenda next, so you'll have a sense of what we're going to talk about before we get there. And a very different feeling that I wanted to talk about is discomfort. Sometimes in workshops like this, we feel uncomfortable. Chances are that we all exhibit some of the characteristics that we're going to talk about today, because we all live in, the same society. So allowing yourself to sit in that discomfort, it's the most important part of being able to learn, is allowing yourself to feel uncomfortable sometimes. And yes, the slides will be provided to you. I think we'll be mailing them out at the end. So I'm trying to talk fast so we can get through everything. Agenda. So we're going to spend about 5 minutes going over an introduction, defining some of the terms before we start. We're going to spend about half an hour or maybe a bit more going over 14 attitudes or norms of white dominant culture and alternatives to them. And then we're going to have breakout rooms where we're going to have 3 breakout rooms. Each breakout room will be assigned 2 norms and asked to discuss how do these exist in our organization? How are they hurting us? How can we change them? What alternatives exist? After the breakout rooms, we'll come back. The facilitator of each breakout room will report back to the group, and we'll end off with some resources. So it should be an hour and a half, the whole workshop. All right. So we all have culture. Culture is a set of ideas. It's what we believe to be true. It's how we interact with each other. It's what we value. It's our way of life. Culture is communication. Communication is culture. And most importantly, no culture is better than another. The thing about organizational culture is that it's very powerful because it's so pervasive and it impacts every part of our work. These days, our work is really a central part of our life. And at the same time, organizational culture can be really hard to name or to identify. The dominant culture in our society is white, middle, and owning class, and is rooted in white supremacy. Cultural racism is how the dominant culture defines reality to validate and to advantage white people while oppressing Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities and individuals. The characteristics of this dominant culture are what is considered normal and even aspirational. And those of us who don't belong to the white, middle, and owning classes are required to adopt certain characteristics in order to assimilate. And this is if assimilation is allowed, because sometimes it's not. The attitudes that we're going to talk about today, they can show up in any of us, in any organization, regardless of our multiple identities, regardless of our race. Many of us grow up learning that these are the values that we need to succeed in life. Others of us have not learned those things. And so, for example, one of the things we're going to go over is the fear of open conflict. This is one of the 14 norms that we're going to explore. Fear of open conflict among each other is not the experience of many of us who are coming from certain immigrant backgrounds or who are coming from poor or working class backgrounds. Just a quick Audre Lorde quote. It is not our difference that divides us, it's our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. So some of the characteristics like fear of open conflict or like perfectionism, they may not be bad, in quotes, in and of themselves, but they do cause harm in the workplace. And this is particularly because they're used as norms and standards without ever being chosen by us, without ever being proactively named. Organizations that are unconsciously using these characteristics make it difficult or even impossible to open the door to other cultural norms and standards. So as a result, a lot of organizations that pride themselves on being multicultural, if they're in fact requiring new participants to adapt to or to conform to dominant white cultural norms, they're not really enacting multiculturalism. I will provide a big list of resources at the end, but I wanted to let you guys know that this framework is based on a workbook. It was developed by an educator named Tema Okun, who is part of a group called Dismantling Racism Works. It was first written in the late 1990s, and it was redeveloped several times, including by the Montreal-based Center for Community Organizations. And I've drawn a lot from their research, which has really bolstered the framework. I hope that this framework is helpful for you, and I hope it resonates with you. Some of it will feel really accurate. Other things you might think to yourself, this doesn't apply. I always say take what helps and leave behind what doesn't, but be open to be challenged. I've kind of categorized each of them under headings. You've seen Perfectionism. Oops. So we're going to start with this heading with 4 different norms and standards under it, and we're just going to jump right in. Okay. So as I'm going through, feel free to write in the chat. I wrote, you can see on the slide, it says drop antidotes in the Zoom chat. You'll kind of know what I mean by antidotes as we go through. We'll be going through each norm and we'll be going over an alternative or an antidote for it. These are not, strict categories. They're not separate from each other. They really bleed into each other. They are different in different contexts. So take them, with a bit of a grain of salt, and let's start. So in a perfectionist culture, mistakes are seen as personal. So in other words, they reflect badly on the person who's making them. Making a mistake is confused with being a mistake or being a bad person or being wrong. And there's little appreciation expressed for the work that others are doing. It's more common to point out how the person or their work is inadequate. Oh, is there a way to make the slide? Do they look bigger if I do this? Great. Can folks see it now? It's readable, okay. So perfectionist organizations tend to be really good at identifying what's wrong, but they can really struggle to identify or name or appreciate what is right and what is working. Perfectionist workplaces struggle with a poisonous level of stress, of anxiety, of self-blame. They struggle with teamwork. There's a avoidance of giving feedback and reflection, and there's a lot of indecision. Perfectionist culture usually gets internalized. So in other words, the perfectionist will tend to fail to appreciate their own good work. They'll constantly fixate on their faults or their own failures, their mistakes, their inadequacies, and there's kind of a constant inner critic. And perfectionism is also really closely linked to a culture of blame, and it relies on guilt, fear, and shame as motivators for work, which contributes to worker burnout and stress. The research that has been done by the Montreal-based Center for Community Organizations, COCO, that I mentioned, it's shown that the requirement for perfect work in organizations often applied unequally. So for example, racialized employees tend to be held to a higher standard, while white employees are allowed to experiment, mess up, learn, and improve. Oh, thanks, Jad Jabber. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing. Thanks for putting in flexibility, community, collective knowledge, sharing, and empathy. Here we have appreciation. All of these are linked. The idea is to emphasize a culture where people feel appreciated in the workplace, where there's kind of a learning culture. It's expected that we're all going to make mistakes, that this is a normal thing to do, and that those mistakes can offer us an opportunity for growth. So recognizing that mistakes are something positive that can lead us to positive results. When things do go wrong in the workplace, we're not looking automatically for who dropped the ball. We're not pulling up emails to see who forgot to email who. You're just moving forward. You're not trying to find someone to blame. When folks are offering feedback in the workplace, you're speaking to things that went well before you're offering criticism. And when you're offering criticism, it's clear and it's direct. And we're developing other sources of motivation other than fear for making mistakes. And someone also wrote psychological safety, which is so important to be able to do that. Up next, either or thinking. So in organizations where either or thinking is prominent, things are either or. They're either good or they're bad. They're right or they're wrong. They're with us or they're against us. And there's not a lot of capacity for recognizing that there's multiple or there's coexisting truths and complexities. It is closely linked to perfectionism, because perfectionists tend to aspire to a singular view or an end goal, which makes it really difficult to learn from mistakes or to take feedback or even to collaborate with other people. This norm, it's really about an individual or organization's inability to deal with complexity. The analysis of situations becomes very superficial. It's not holistic. So for example, believing that poor health among newcomers is the result of lack of knowledge about health. So if we hand out pamphlets about health, then we solve the problem. Either or thinking is also tied to other characteristics that we're going to explore, like paternalism. It's often offered by people who have a clear agenda and they want to make it seem like they're giving you a choice, when really the choice is between A or B and there isn't a chance to actually offer other options. It's also related to defensiveness. So an inability to see complexity means that when you point out an issue at work, for example, related to race, others might jump to say, it's not possible, I'm not racist, because the situation can only be racist or not racist. There's no ability to see any kind of complexity. Our antidotes: system thinking, allowing complexity. So first of all, notice when people use either or language. It's either this or that. And replace it with both and. It could be both of these things, and it could also be. Notice when people are oversimplifying complex issues. Try to slow it down, try to encourage a deeper analysis, and urge your team to come up with more than a couple answers to a problem. Try to avoid making decisions under extreme pressure, because this is when it's hard to think with creativity. So, making space to plan ahead, plan, decades ahead, plan, not just our usual 5-year strategic plan meetings, but to actually think about the way that our work is heading and how we're reaching the organization's vision. In NGOs, in the newcomer sector and beyond, we tend to have very, very strong visions, or like vision statements, of a world where all of us are equal, things like this. And then our work, there seems to be a little bit of a divide between the vision and the daily work. So trying to bridge this. Develop your team's techniques for thinking in complex and nuanced ways. This could be doing exercises like mind maps for brainstorming or other types of systems mapping. And all of these things, there's a lot of resources for how to do these things, but you're not expected to be able to think creatively out of nowhere. There's tools that we can use to bring those to play. And here's just a little graphic about systems thinking. Systems thinking is a way for teams and individuals to look for changes that will give long-term improvements instead of the quick fix. If you look into systems thinking, there are strategies and activities you can do to kind of enact this exercise. Okay. So, individualism and competition. So here again, with individualism, there's focus a lot on single charismatic leaders who tend to work in isolation. And individualism is very strongly linked to the meritocracy myth. This is the idea that privilege, wealth, positions of power, they're won by those who have earned it thanks to their hard work, their achievements, or sometimes by their inherent superiority. Within the rationale of the meritocracy myth is the belief that those who are disenfranchised or powerless are so because they didn't work hard enough, or that they're somehow inferior. And the meritocracy myth really erases structural inequality and the ability to see how systems of power operate. Again, feel free to write alternatives in the chat if you can think of any. In individualist organizations, competition is more highly valued than cooperation. So how often do we hear workers applauded for being able to get things done on their own, without guidance, without collaboration? And these characteristics are really highly valued. This is really closely linked to this belief that I'm the only one. I'm the only one who can do this. If I want something to be done right, I have to do it myself. So people who have this belief often have little ability or no ability to trust and to delegate work to others. And those on the receiving end of the lack of the trust, they don't often get a chance to learn new skills. They don't feel trusted. They don't feel like they have their own agency. In an individualist organization, credit is given to individuals, and it often erases the many people or the broad movements that are involved. You know, a lot of our wins in our organizations, they tend to be really rooted in broad social movements that have been fighting for the things that we are working for as well. Individualism and competition, they can lead to isolation, they can lead to burnout, resentment, and disempowerment. So some alternatives. Again, these are not the alternative, there's some alternatives. Community and collaboration. So building community in the workplace. In an organization that values community and collaboration, you're mutually supporting the work of other organizations and other movements that have shared values. You're promoting each other's campaigns, you're promoting each other's issues and programs rather than competing with them. Team meetings at these organizations should be a place to solve problems and to break workplace isolation, and not just as a place to report on activities. Workers should be able to feel safe bringing problems to the group for feedback and not feel like they have failed at their job. Collaboration should be applauded and articulated as a key skill. And to go back to systems thinking, fostering a way of thinking that promotes the interdependence of all of us and all social justice struggles, because we all rely on each other. And I dropped in another quote: fundamental law of human beings is interdependence. A person is a person through other people, other persons. This is from the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He went on to say, "My humanity is caught up and bound inextricably with yours." It says, not as Descartes did, "I think, therefore I am," but rather, "I am because I belong." I need other humans in order to be human. We're created for a delicate network of relationships, of interdependence, with our fellow human beings and with the rest of creation. So we've reached the first norm that's going to be saved for our breakout rooms. So I'm just going to explain it, but we're going to save talking about the alternatives for when we break out. So superiority of the written word, or you can call it worship of the written word. This is a feature or a norm or a standard where written communication is valued above all other forms of communication that organizations rely on to do their work. People in the organization who have strong documentation and writing skills tend to be more highly valued, even in organizations where the ability to relate to others in ways other than writing are actually essential to the work. The organization doesn't take into account or value other ways in which information gets shared, and the organization undervalues or dismisses the emotion and the tone and the relational impact of communication, because a lot of this tends to get erased when things are put into writing. There exists a low culture, or a culture of low trust and micromanagement. So for example, requiring an unreasonable amount of documentation to prove that you've been doing your work, or having all of your work rewritten when it's not necessary. The multitude of ways that individuals are integrating and processing information as opposed to just reading are dismissed or ignored. So important information is only being shared in writing and not in team meetings, for example. And I just wanted to share this for our discussion groups, because I find that in the newcomer sector, we tend to rely heavily on communication that is not written, particularly not written in English. And actually this type of communication is essential to our work, to being able to reach out to other communities, and it tends to be undervalued. So I will save that for folks to discuss in the breakouts. We're going to an umbrella term, concentration of power, and we're going to walk through 4 more norms and standards. I know we're moving really fast, so you will get the resources at the end, and you'll get this slideshow at the end. And if you're able to think of antidotes or alternatives as we go, please drop them in the chat. So paternalism as a term, it's the practice of people in positions of power or authority restricting the responsibilities or the freedoms of those who are subordinate to them. And it's done supposedly in the subordinate's best interest. In paternalistic organizations, decision-making is very clear to those with power and very unclear to those who don't have it. So people with power know exactly what the roles and responsibilities are of each person, but it's not being communicated to the folks who are subordinate to them. People with power think that they can make decisions for and in the interest of those without power, often without consultation. Opinions and solutions are presented as final word on the matter by those who do have authority. And there can be a lot of condescension or infantilization of others, and workers feel like they're not being trusted or valued, or that they've been stripped of the agency to make decisions. An alternative to it, partnership. So cultivating transparency and open dialogue around decision-making, ensuring that everyone has a part in making important decisions, making sure that everyone knows and understands their level of responsibility and authority in the organization. This is actually a very simple thing, knowing exactly what your role is, and yet we often don't see it. Meaningfully including those who are impacted by a decision in the decision-making process. Power hoarding. So organizations that enact this norm believe power to be limited with only so much to go around. In power hoarding organizations, those with power feel threatened when anyone suggests changes to how things could be done. And leaders perceive suggestions for change as a criticism of their leadership, failing to recognize that this is a part of power hoarding. Those with power, they believe they have the best interests of the organizations at heart, and they assume ill intent from people who want change. And people who ask for change tend to be labeled as uninformed, you don't know enough, or inexperienced, you just got here, you haven't been here long enough to understand. There's a culture of leader worship in power hoarding organizations where one person tends to hold a lot of power and they're praised as a really great worker or a hero to the community. Power hoarding often requires secrecy. Decision-making is, of course, not transparent. Information or relationships are gatekept, so those without power are required to go through the person with power in order to do their work. An alternative, power sharing. Power could be shared, and ideas at all levels valued for the expertise that they offer in relation to their position. Change is understood as inevitable, and challenges to leadership are important and healthy for the team. This also means supporting the development of others' leadership skills. So often in leader worship organizations, internally, no one is being prepared to take on higher roles. Instead, one person is kind of gatekeeping all this information, and they're not really nurturing leadership in their staff. So no one can really take on management if something happens to your manager. And they often will tend to bring in people from outside. So instead of thinking that there are hero leaders, we have to understand that there's many leaders and that all of us could be leaders. Budgets and other essential information should be made available, and resources should be shared appropriately. These things shouldn't be kept secret. And resisting and challenging competitiveness, prioritizing cooperation and collaboration instead. This helps to shift the implicit assumptions about leaders and leadership that can prevent power sharing from occurring. And we're going to go through two that will also be saved for further discussion in the breakout groups. The first one is comfort with predominantly white leadership. This is the idea that a lot of organizations will default to all or mostly white leadership, and predominantly white leadership is not seen as a problem, and it's often considered invisible. When it is challenged, a sense of urgency and a lack of available or qualified people is given as justification. And the next one is equity washing. This is when organizations are hiring people of color to validate the organization as a multicultural or a diverse workplace, but they're not supporting the cultural shift to retain them. So particularly in the newcomer sector, we often see hires, token hires, if you will, who are not trusted for the expertise that they're bringing to the organization, but for their ability to attract their community. There's a focus on inclusion internally while the field work is perpetuating inequity, or the opposite. Maybe there's a focus on diversity in the field work while internally there's a huge equity problem. And tokenism, yeah, absolutely. The right to comfort. So fear of open conflict, defensiveness, this is sort of something we mentioned at the beginning. So this is the notion that people with power have a right to comfort. And we're talking about the same discomfort that we spoke about at the beginning, the discomfort of being challenged. In this context, we're often talking about people who either have formal or informal power in our workplaces. And people who cause discomfort by pointing things out tend to get scapegoated. So for example, people of color who point out organizational racism can become the subject of scrutiny rather than those who are complicit in perpetuating the oppressive dynamics within the organization. At other times, individual acts of unfairness against white people are conflated with systemic or structural racism that targets people of color, as if these are the same thing. A big part of this norm is that people in power tend to avoid conflict and disagreement. And this means, in terms of the work, that useful and timely feedback isn't given. And so workers could end up underperforming. There's a lack of growth because you're not getting useful feedback. And there's a distorted sense of how well or not well you're doing your job. And workers tend to pick up when they're not receiving accurate feedback and tend to internalize, to feel imposter syndrome, or to feel like they're doing something wrong and to be constantly second guessing themselves. Workplaces that avoid conflict tend to let really small problems go unattended until they become huge issues down the road. And when we talk about defensive organizations, these are places where it doesn't feel safe to air grievances. And when someone raises an issue that causes discomfort, the response is to interrogate the person instead of interrogating the problem. Some alternatives: constructive and direct feedback, growth, learning, vulnerability. So this is understanding that discomfort is at the root of all growth and learning, and its presence is usually signaling the need for some deep self-reflection. We need to be able to distinguish between being impolite and bringing up difficult issues. And vulnerability is really important here because this dominant culture also tells us that we're supposed to arrive already understanding everything. It's hard for us to recognize that we're all capable of hurting each other, of making harmful mistakes. And so when peers call us out, we have to be ready to be vulnerable, to listen, to acknowledge, and to see how we can make amends. Linked really close to this is unlearning attitudes around quote unquote acceptable ways of calling attention to painful truths. So making space for emotion. Someone shouldn't be required to calm themselves down and think about how to confront you gently if you're the one who has caused them harm. And at the same time, managers should be providing really timely, direct, and constructive feedback. And there should be a two-way sense of accountability encouraged, which means that it's not just managers who are giving you feedback. There should be a chance for you to also give feedback to managers, or across power dynamics, basically. Building conflict resolution skills is a really key part of this work. So, for example, teams could role play ways to handle conflict before conflict happens. They could role play ways to call each other in and how to respond. They could learn to hold truth-telling conversations regularly as a team. And once a conflict is resolved, they can revisit it later to consider how it could have been handled better or differently. Conflict resolution skills, these are workshops that you can bring folks in to help your team with, or you can find, templates for them and try to work it out with your team. I'm sure you've noticed by now, but all of the pink ones are the ones we're saving for our discussion groups. Changing the subject away from the role of race, or avoiding talking about race in the workplace. So this comes out of a limited understanding of how biases based on race and culture interplay with all aspects of our lives and systems. There's a limited understanding of privileges and disadvantages that systematically oppress folks who are in the workplace and beyond, of course. And difference is seen as bad. There's a pursuit of total cohesion between all workers. There's a perception that talking about oppression or biases is an attack on white people, or that white people can't handle the conversation, and so we shouldn't go there. And we'll save discussion for breakout. Lots of talking. Oops. Yeah. Okay. No. All right. Transactional relationships and goals. So in transactional organizations, the main communication between workers is detached and for the purpose of completing a transaction. Reaching out or acknowledging people only happens when you need something from them. There's a big focus under this whole umbrella of bigger, more. There's a huge focus on achieving high numbers, and this is ranked above meaningful engagement. The resources of an organization are directed towards providing or producing measurable outcomes like event attendance numbers, like newsletter reach, and things that can be measured are more highly valued than things that can't be measured. So for example, making sure you have a high number of clients in your program is more valued than the quality of the support that you're able to give a smaller number. And as a result of transactional relationships and goals, processes can be sacrificed in favor of efficiency or of getting things done. And there's a constant sense of urgency to the work that makes it really difficult to take time for thoughtful decision making, to plan long term, or to consider consequences. An alternative for us, transformational relationships and goals. So even in the simplest ways, taking time to see, greet, and acknowledge each other, sustaining caring connections, this is especially when it feels like there's no time to do so, is when we should be reaching out to one another. Working towards meaningful engagement with one another and with the community, using qualitative goals in addition to whatever deliverables that your funder is asking for. So developing other ways to measure the success of the work. Recognizing that meaningful work takes time and ensuring that funding proposals are written with realistic timeframes. This goes back to the work often of managers, creating work plans that will set up workers to succeed, not to feel stressed and in a constant state of urgency. Discussing what it means to set goals around anti-racism, around anti-colonialism, and other forms of oppression. And dedicating time to support individual and organizational learning, like we are today, but also on an ongoing and a sustained basis. Progress is bigger or more. So this feature is describing an understanding of progress as organizational expansion. This means, adding staff or adding projects, or the ability to serve more people, but regardless of how well the community is being served. When progress is seen as expansion only, there's a focus on quantity. There's little consideration for the cost of expansion. So for example, growth can also mean increased control over your organization by funders or other external stakeholders. It can mean the exclusion or the underserving of the community as focus shifts from quality to quantity. It could mean the burnout of staff and volunteers is treated as a necessary evil in the name of growth. And overall, the belief that success and progress is synonymous with bigger and more is rooted in capitalism. And I have a quote from Vandana Shiva. An obsession with growth has eclipsed our concern for sustainability, justice, and human dignity. But people are not disposable. The value of life lies outside of economic development. Some antidotes: understanding progress as sustainability and as quality. So when organizations are doing a cost-benefit analysis of expansion, this needs to include all costs and not just financial ones. So this should include human costs. So for example, the impact on morale, or the impact on the use of resources, the impact on the community. We're not saying that expanding your organization is bad, of course. But as many of you know in the sector, and if you've been in the sector for a long time, it feels like projects and activities are expected to grow every year, even without additional staff or resources. Growth should not be prioritized over ensuring that workers are not overburdened, or in turn, that the community is being meaningfully served. So we need to make room to evaluate how growth and change affects all workers and the community, and we need to include progress goals in our planning. This is like thinking about how we want to do our work, not just what we want to do. One way that we can do this is taking the time to think about our vision for our organization in the far future. We mentioned this a bit earlier. So this is not just our 5-year strategic plan. We're fostering 7th generation thinking by asking, how can the actions that we do now affect people 7 generations from now? We have 2 more, and then we're going to go into breakout groups. So priorities and timelines that perpetuate white supremacy culture. There's a constant sense of urgency that is given to funder deliverables, but not for the type of work that's going to challenge white supremacy culture. So what I mean by this is that when it's time to talk about ensuring that you have 100 clients in your program, there's a sense of importance and urgency. There's clear timelines, there's dedicated hours, but the type of work that's going to disrupt the culture that we've been talking about today gets put on the back burner. And this means things like community building, capacity building, and equity education are not considered a priority, even though they are essential to the work and ultimately to the vision of the organization. And Tim writes, capitalism has a fetish for growth. Absolutely. And the article that is mentioned by Vandana Shiva is all about that, and how this constant search for growth becomes anti-life. Another one for our discussion is overworking is an unstated norm. So encouraging people to work through weekends and into the night, either directly or passively by setting up work plans that are unachievable. When workers try to set boundaries, the importance of the work is thrown back at them. And I added this in particular because your work is so important, and we all know it's so important. But how often are you put in a position where you're required to overwork, you feel guilty because the organization has given you more work than your timeline can handle, or you haven't been given the resources, the timeline, the space for planning that would allow you to not overwork. A significant thing to add here is that this practice ignores how Black and Brown people have been historically and systemically requested to take on physically taxing work by white bosses. And so this norm really does impact people differently. I'm going to get a break from talking. Breakout groups. All right, so a couple reminders before we start. This is a learning space, so you shouldn't be afraid to admit if you don't know or understand something, or to ask questions. Your facilitator might not have the answer, but as a group, we can try to answer. There is no right answer. So when we're looking for alternatives, it's not like the facilitators have a word that they're trying to get you to guess. There's a lot of answers, and we're trying to get towards them by discussing. So please don't be afraid to engage. That's how most of us learn, and that's the goal of this workshop. Another point is what's learned here leaves here and what's shared here stays here. So what I mean by that is that all of the information that we've shared today that's in the PowerPoint, all of that should leave here. You should be speaking about it with your colleagues and families and communities. But if people share personal stories, please don't share them without permission. Each group is going to be given 2 norms for discussion. And you'll have kind of these 2 guiding questions. We're trying to look at how does this show up in our work and what are steps we could take to get to an alternative, or what does an alternative look like? We also want to offer space for talking about, are they hurting us? How are they hurting us? Are we being impacted differently by it? You know, are these norms impacting workers differently based on who they are or their multiple identities? If we can envision an alternative, how do we take steps today to get there? How do we take steps, you know, that might be more long-term to get there? Each of you will have a facilitator in your group who will tell you what the 2 norms are, and will just help the conversation flow. And we have just under, no, I think we have time for almost a full half hour. Yeah. So.
Lovely. Okay, so I will just creating the breakout rooms. There will be 3 of them, so just bear with me. Okay. I just want to ensure that the facilitator is in each one. Okay, so I will open the rooms and folks should get a notification to join.
Cindy, I'm here. I'm just not hello.
Welcome back. Oh, I guess the other groups are still closing. It's just,
Yeah, it was so nice to meet all of you. I'm going to put my email in the chat if you want to reach out. I'm at Newcomer Women's Services, Toronto.
thank you. Welcome back, everyone.
Mhm.
Okay, I don't know if we're all back.
All of the rooms have closed, so everybody should be back yet.
All right. I can start, and then the other two facilitators, we're just going to give a brief recap of what we talked about.
Sure.
Okay, so my group, we had equity washing and overworking. So in terms of equity washing or token hiring, folks described people being hired for like diverse hires, but they're not being able to progress into management, hired as a means to an end, and they eventually understand this and it impacts them. In fact, it impacts the whole organization. Folks talked about programs that this is also a problem coming from funders, from government, from foundations, and it's rooted in white supremacy. It's driven by a top-down approach. Hiring for the purpose of showing that your organization is multicultural, but then folks are forced to adjust to how things are being done, even in orgs that are formally dealing with multiculturalism and diversity. Some folks said this really needs to come from HR and from higher ups, from ethical hiring practices, and that it's a responsibility of the entire organization, that we need to place pressure on funders and not just accept things as they are. There needs to be advocacy and accountability to them. And that we had a great conversation. There's so much. People talked about, being set up with jobs that won't have access to benefits or enough time to do their jobs. This also links to overworking. We talked about how good management makes any worker into a good asset to the organization, and that it can be hard to build this up, but it's worth it. Someone gave an example of how there's different norms, so sometimes we need different services. If you're looking at mental health services, a counseling program won't be the most effective program for everyone. Sometimes it'll be a peer support program, for example. And we also talked about unequal resources being given to different newcomers and refugees. We talked about how things like this tend to pit people of color and Black and Indigenous people against each other by not having an equal distribution of resources, in a sense that there's scarcity. We talked about overworking as a system-wide problem. Someone said, in their 20 years that it never used to be okay to put yourself first. Now they're starting to see language where you can be a little bit more selfish. You can put in boundaries. It's not always accepted. And especially in the virtual age when we're working on Zoom, sometimes it feels like there's no boundaries. But now we're starting to have the language to be able to challenge it. Someone said that their team leader really stands with them on not overworking. And when they don't meet deliverables, they get defended, like their leader defends them and stands with them and encourages them to put boundaries, and that was really effective. We talked about the fact that people are exploited in this sector because it's more than just work. It's our mission, it's our passion. A lot of people's identities are tied to this work. And we also said that it's a problem across the sector, that this is an underfunded sector where people are paid less and expected to work more. And so there needs to be an advocacy component to that. People said community and collaboration helps fight this, because if you're separate, you're competing for clients or deliverables instead of working together to achieve these unachievable numbers until we reach a point where we can challenge our funders. Okay. Tinvit, do you want to go ahead with your group?
Sure. I just saw that Paulina had her hand raised. Paulina, did you have a question?
Is this a good time for a question or comment, or should I hold it until the end? What would be helpful?
It depends if it's a clarifying question. Otherwise, maybe we can.
It's more of a comment on something that's occurred to me from what you're saying, but also from what was being said earlier. Maybe I'll hold it till the end.
Yeah, and then folks, if anyone needs to run off, it'll be okay, and we can stick around and talk a little bit more after.
Yeah, so I can share what was discussed in our breakout room. So we had the two concepts that we had were superiority of the nonprofit written word, as well as changing the subject away from the role of race. So I'll just do very briefly, just in interest of time. So some of the things that were discussed was focusing more on quantitative data and collecting stories, but actually prior to that, what was discussed was really understanding that this is more of a systemic issue rather than it being directly the organization or the leadership that are scrutinizing the written word. So understanding that, you know, the funders and the role that they play in ensuring that the written word, ensuring that the written word or the point is getting across clearly in order to prevent any impacts or negative impacts on programs is important. But yes, really understanding that quantitative data is important, collecting stories when there is word or documents that are being edited, what's the function or the purpose of it? Is it, you know, to ensure that the point is getting across clearly, or is it to micromanage? In terms of some alternatives or some anecdotes, having cross-cultural coaching for management would be helpful. Having multiple forms of communication, so written, in person, and really allowing folks to thrive in the way that they communicate best. Sharing spaces, having multiple spaces to share these stories. And also being mindful of languages and phrases that could potentially be triggering. That's important to note, and to not assume you understand what is being said, but making sure that you get some clarification. One thing that was mentioned in terms of how the sector looks is there's a lot of high turnover. So it is also important to find a balance between having that documentation as a part of the organization, but ensuring that it's not negatively impacting the staff that are creating that documentation. For the second point, the changing the subject away from the role of race. So it is something that obviously comes up, but one of the things that were discussed was we are seeing that the sector is transitioning or starting to see more folks in upper management and leadership that represent the staff and the clients that they're serving, but that it can't be tokenized, that the larger system would have to be changed to actually see that anti-oppressive change. And even when there are leadership that are BIPOC, the relationship that the newcomer serving sector has with organizations or with bodies like CBSA or IRCC funders, they still are very much white and move or don't look at the role of race. And so some alternatives would be to make the change from the top down, ensuring that there's restructuring in policies and having a strong EDI framework incorporated into the organization, and moving away from tokenism, as well as folks being comfortable with the uncomfortable conversation that would happen. That's it for Martin. Thanks.
Thank you. I think I can go next. So we had a very fruitful conversation too, and we had comfort with predominantly white leadership, priorities, and timelines that perpetuate white supremacy culture. But we also talked about, I think it's one of the big points, which is the worship of the written word. So we talked about how the funding and how the desire for more funding sort of fosters also the other characteristics of white supremacy culture, which are individualism and perfectionism, and how it is difficult to navigate the desire for more funding and to refuse that as well. We talked about how meeting deliverables sort of becomes a priority in the work, and sometimes that trumps a desire for social change, which is usually what brings people to this field. We also talk about, in terms of the language piece, we talk about how there's a power imbalance as well. When we talked about the desire for the written word, a power imbalance between how some documents also become so inaccessible for newcomers, and that creates a power imbalance between service providers and service users. And then in terms of the antidotes, we talked about decentralizing whiteness. I think we talked about how these characteristics of white supremacy also sort of connect with each other, and the importance of decentralizing whiteness and refusing whiteness as well. And talked about microaggressions, we talked about language, and how also for people who speak English as a second or third or fourth language, oftentimes they're seen through a deficit lens, and also sort of challenging that. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for reporting back. We had such great conversations, and it sounds like you guys did too. And I feel like I should have taken the advice of the workshop and just put a little bit less so we had a little bit more time. But I'm just going to show you my screen for a few seconds before we hop off, just to show you the list of resources and the contact at the end. Yeah. Okay, great. What's happening? There we go. Nope. Sorry. There. Okay. We're going to send this out. It has a huge list of resources on anti-racism. At the top is the workshop resources. These are the 3 organizations that have resources really specific to white supremacy, culture, norms, and standards. So if you wanted to read more about those. And then I have a bunch of books and shorter articles that relate to anti-racism, environmental racism, anti-Black racism, settler colonialism. If you keep going, there's stuff on Orientalism and border imperialism, which is more related to xenophobia. And my contact information is in the slides as well. And these are all just at the end. We'll send out the Prezi. And thank you everyone so much for joining us, and for folks who stuck around as we're 10 minutes over. Tinbit, did you want to say anything before we closed off?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure if Paulina still wanted to make your comment, but yeah, I can.
You know what? I'll save it for another time, because I think it would open up a discussion, and this was a nice ending the way that it was ended. So.
Lovely. Okay. Well, yes, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. I know there's a lot of valuable information shared, and as Rana had mentioned, we'll be sharing it to folks after the meeting. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a part of a series, so please keep a lookout for more sessions in the upcoming months. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone, for spending your afternoon with us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Oh.
Hey.
Okay. Let me make sure I